Welcome, Pastor Ray, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mel.
Today, Rhema Church's congregation in Johannesburg numbers over 45,000 people, but you pioneered the church in the early 1980s with just 13 people in a living room. And this, of course, was a time when apartheid was still very much a reality in South Africa. How much was apartheid a motivating factor in your decision early on to get involved with political leaders?
I think that as the crisis in the country grew, and as we were confronted with the issues that were taking place, I began to realize that we needed to become relevant within our communities, within our cities, and in our townships and the rural areas as well, because we were facing a civil war. And I then began to go with people like Archbishop Tutu, Dr. Frank Chikane and others that were part of the South African Council of Churches, to where people were being killed. There were major confrontations taking place in the country. There was a third force involved. There were so many different things. But the real thing was that I had a man in our church who was very successful in business, and he was colored, and his whole family were very committed to the church. And he'd be involved with his family in many of the activities of the church. Now, when we started, I never even thought about color. I never thought about the issue of black and white. I never even looked at it at that time. But then when it grew to a place where I realized that apartheid was not a political issue, but a moral issue, it came about with this man wanting to move near the church, and he could afford it to get a nice home. And because of his color, he could not live near the church. So he came to see me, and he said, you know, my children are in the children's church. We're accepted here, but we can't live here. And that was called the Group Areas Act. So I then made a statement to the media, and then started to get involved in the fact that these immoral issues needed to be addressed, that these need to be confronted, and the church needs to be involved. And that time in the Pentecostal charismatic movement 30 years or so ago, I'm talking about, it was a no-no, basically. And I then began to have dinners at my house with church leaders, business leaders, and it took me on a fascinating, challenging change in my life. I call it Damascus experience, based on those meetings and dinners that we had. And that was the beginning of the journey.
And during the last few years of Nelson Mandela's incarceration, you actually became a broker for political peace behind the scenes. You worked with Mr. Mandela to set up meetings with his opponents in the ruling National Party. Along the way, you worked with notable figures like Archbishop Tutu, whom you just mentioned. How did you become involved in that particular process? Were you invited into it, or was it something that you or your team pursued in some way?
We pursued it because I began to realize that it's one thing to be evangelistically potent, prophetically relevant, but socially significant is a major issue in our constituency that was weak. And thank goodness today we have hundreds of churches that are involved in feeding, taking medical doctors, dentists into the rural or the poor areas, the disadvantaged areas. And over a period of time, through those dinners that I had at my house, we initiated the Peace Accord. Now, there were obviously other people involved, other people behind the scenes, other people doing things. But basically, out of those dinners came the Peace Accord. And so we were really, really thrown into the deep end as well with that. And I would then go out with church leaders and go to these places of where there was turmoil and violence, and started to get more involved. And then over a period of time, you create a credibility with people, with the media, with others, with government, that basically gives you a platform to have a voice. It doesn't just come by turning up one day. It's over a long process. It's when you actually produce the fruit and you make your stand and you're committed to being involved wherever you can.
And so as a result of all of that, you've been very active in the political sphere now for a long period, and you've got a voice into very senior levels of government. Some people, of course, in the church would argue that the church shouldn't have anything to do with politics because Jesus didn't. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that's why I'm not talking politics. I'm talking about morality. I'm talking about meeting people's needs. I'm talking about the fact that there are people out there that need to be touched with the compassion of the church. I'm talking about being involved in issues. For instance, I do an article which is doing incredibly well in the country, bi-weekly in the major newspaper. So this Tuesday I did one on all the police that have been killed. We've had over 50 police killed since the beginning of the year, and that the churches need to initiate in the police stations some initiatives with the police in partnership to try and help deal with this type of situation. That all the council of churches, different religions, because you can form alliances with other religions. Doesn't mean you're going to have to agree on major issues, but when it comes to policing and the corruption and the killing of police and different things that are going on, we can form alliances to combat that. Prostitution, drug trade, the slave trade has become a huge issue. These are things that the church needs to be vocal, needs to be relevant, and needs to be involved with.
And your history suggests that you are a very big believer in building alliances. You've formed a number of major confederations within the wider church in South Africa over the years. Today you're the co-chair of a thing called the National Interfaith Council of South Africa, NICSA for short, which, as I understand it, is made up of mainstream churches, Pentecostal churches, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu communities. What do you think NICSA can achieve that local churches on their own can't?
Well, I think first of all that we need to try and broaden our vision beyond the local church influence and understand that we can make an impact and influence a nation. I've had the privilege of basically being involved with over 6 presidents and continue to do so on that basis. And that comes over a time of being involved, being committed, and being relevant. And that it's vitally important that we look to being relevant further than just the local church service. You see, for instance, I realized this years ago that a person came for prayer one day and they wanted me to pray for them to get a job. But then when I began to question them about themselves, they were living in a place where they had no telephone, no running water, no money, and couldn't get out of the cycle of the poverty. So he couldn't read or write. Now, how do you go for a job if you've got no transport and you can't fill in a form, if you haven't got a telephone to be contacted about the job? So we would many times criticize somebody and say they're lazy or they're this or they're that. But the reality is he was in the cycle of poverty. And just praying for him on a Sunday morning for 2 minutes really didn't solve his problem. What became an issue of solving that problem would be to first of all teach him to read and write, to help him get in a position where he can fill in forms, to address the issue of the running water, to address the issue of how can we help him to get out of that cycle of poverty. And that became something that spoke to our cities and to our nation over a period of time.
I guess you're familiar with the quotation from former US President Gerald Ford, who famously said that a government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take from you everything you have. Do you think governments today, national governments, regional governments, have too much influence, especially on things like ethics and values in society? And has the church lost ground a bit when it comes to being a prophetic voice into government and society?
Yes, I think the first thing is that church and state needs to be separate. That's vitally important. Because of our past history, that became a major issue in the transformation. Secondly, that you partnership with government, not with political parties. That there are things we can do with government without being controlled by government, without them taking it over and directed it in a direction you're not happy with, on the basis of partnership. And I think you'll find that anywhere in the world, most governments would be very happy to partnership with the church and do initiatives concerning the moral bill of responsibilities, education, health, crime, these issues, slave trades, all the different issues that are very relevant at the moment, and concerning the issues that become prevalent in different places. Different countries might have a different culture, different background, and different issues, but they need to be addressed.